Welcome to Hill Country Homilies, weekly homilies from Holy Annunciation Orthodox Church in Liberty Hill, Texas. Holy Annunciation is an old calendar Orthodox church, sharing the faith of the apostles and the love of Christ with all who seek his truth. Now let's listen to this week's homily.
Christ is risen. Cristo ha resucitado. Christos anesti. Today, on the second Sunday after Pascha, but third Sunday of Pascha, we remember the myrrh-bearing women who anointed the body of Christ, who came to the tomb to anoint the body of Christ. We remember St. Joseph of Arimathea, who asked Pilate that he may have the body of Christ, and Nicodemus, who helped in the burial of Christ. And the gospel reading begins with St. Joseph asking Pilate to give him the body, and it ends with the myrrh-bearing women being told at the tomb that Christ isn't there, that he's risen, and to go proclaim those glad tidings to the apostles. And when I read this particular gospel reading, there are several things that come to mind. The first is the great risk that Joseph of Arimathea was willing to take in order to bury Christ. You see, Joseph, we're told, it says he's an honorable counselor. Well, what does that mean? Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin, which is the supreme council of the Jews. He was a wealthy man. He was at the top of his society. He was at the top of his church. But he was also a secret disciple of Christ. Now, it's easy, or maybe easier, to do those things in secret because there's no risk to him. He can secretly believe that Christ is the Son of God, that Christ is the Messiah. He can secretly follow him. He might even secretly give him support, might secretly give him aid. But when those things are done in secret, so long as they're not discovered, there's very little risk to the person that does them. And when you're talking about a matter of faith, something that's held in the heart, unless you reveal that to somebody, you really have no risk of discovery. You can think and believe in your heart whatever you want. Unless you let that out, it stays your secret. And so Joseph of Arimathea, while he was entrenched in the upper levels of the Jewish faith and the governance as a counselor of the Sanhedrin, he was also secretly a disciple of Christ. But the crucifixion of Christ and the sight of his body upon the cross was a decision point for Joseph of Arimathea. He could either leave him upon the cross and let him be taken by the guard and buried with the common thieves that hung on either side of him, or he could be certain that the body of the person he believed to be the Messiah would be given the care and burial that it deserved. But to do that, he had to reveal himself. He had to go not only and ask Pilate for the body, but then he buried it in his own tomb. He didn't just take the body and give it to someone else to take care of it. He placed it in the tomb. And in doing this, he exposed himself to death, to persecution, to a downfall within his entire world. Everything that he held dear other than Christ, and everything that composed his place in society was now subject to being destroyed because he showed his love for Christ. This gospel reading also brings to mind the issue of the place of women within the church, because we often, as Orthodox Christians with a male priesthood, hear people say that we minimize women, but in this reading we see how important a place women play in the church. It was the women that diligently waited at the foot of the cross, while all but one of the disciples ran away and hid in fear. The women didn't have that fear. It was the women who, with Joseph of Arimathea, Mary Magdalene, and the other Mary, who witnessed where the body of Christ was laid. It was the women who were the first witnesses to the resurrection when they discovered the empty tomb and the angel awaiting them, the stone rolled away and the sheet on the stone. And he says, "You seek Christ who is crucified. He is not here. He is risen. Go tell everybody." And they were the first to meet the risen Christ. That's actually the next part of the gospel. If we served matins this morning, it would have been the matins gospel reading. It says, when Jesus was risen early the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 devils, and she went and told them that had been with him, as they mourned and wept. And they, when they heard that he was alive and had seen of her, believed not. And after that, he appeared in another form unto 2 of them, as they walked and went into the country. So the first two appearances of the risen Christ were to the women, not to the disciples, not to the apostles, but to the women. St. Peter Chrysologus, who was a bishop of Ravenna in the mid-400s, compares the women to the role of the women to the role of the apostles. He says this: the women were the first to honor the risen Christ, the apostles the first to suffer for him. The women were ready with spices, the apostles were ready for their scourges. The women entered the tomb, the apostles would soon enter the dungeons and the jails. The women hastened to express their eulogy, while the apostles embraced chains for his sake. The women poured oils on the body, but the apostles would soon pour out their own blood. Everybody had an important role in the resurrection and the preaching of the gospel, men and women alike, but each in their own way, as continues to this day. Now, when we read this particular passage, the question that I think that everybody should ask themselves is this: what is it that we risk for Christ? Joseph of Arimathea risked his entire life. The apostles risked their very life. The myrrh-bearing women, same risk, to be found a disciple of this man. What do we today risk for Christ? Do we risk friendships by sharing the gospel, by inviting people to church with us? Do we risk our business by not separating what we would call our church life and our secular life, as if the two are unrelated to one another? Do we risk our social standing if we confess traditional beliefs of Christian morality, like the sanctity of marriage, of life, of moderation, if we confess the traditional matters of Christian praxis, fasting, the necessities of the mysteries of the church, if we confess the traditional Christian beliefs in today's culture, the creation account, the oneness of the church, the literal nature of the Eucharist, true body, true blood, the very truth of the resurrection, if we confess those things, do we risk our own social standing? People go, oh, that's foolish, that's mythology. Will we take that risk for Christ, or will we keep it secretly, as Joseph of Arimathea did before he saw Christ on the cross? You know, this unwillingness to risk social standing for Christ has serious consequences in our society. We see it, I believe, in the attack on sacramental Christianity that's been part of this pandemic. A few weeks ago, I talked about how people are unable to understand that for a sacramental Christian, online church is not good enough. That taking the mysteries of Christ, the Holy Eucharist, physically is the essence of the expression of our faith. That if we don't have the Eucharist, we don't have the church. If you're not a sacramental Christian, if you're one of those newly created religions, you can do your whole church online because it's no different than when you do it in person. But if you receive the true body and true blood of Christ in the Eucharist, you can only do that in person. Well, as our society begins to reopen from the shutdown that we've been in, earlier this week, Knoxville, Tennessee, Knox County, they announced their plans for reopening churches. And these plans had one specific rule: no physical taking of the sacraments. In other words, every single church could open and conduct its service, but if they were Roman Catholic, if they were Anglican, even High Lutheran, and certainly Orthodox, those groups, if they met, they could not give out the sacrament. And nobody stood up and spoke against it. See, whether we're speaking of Joseph of Arimathea, of the myrrh-bearing women of the apostles, not to mention the thousands upon thousands of holy martyrs, we have so many models of those who have risked everything up to their very lives for Christ. And on this Sunday, those examples are directly in front of us. One of the words used to describe Joseph of Arimathea is bold. He boldly went to Pilate and begged for his body, even at great cost for himself. How can we be bold in our lives? This is a question that we should ask ourselves, certainly this Sunday, if not every single Sunday. So brothers and sisters, we depart today. Let us give thanks to God for the holy examples of Joseph and the myrrh-bearing women who risked much for the love of their Lord. By their example, may we be made bold to proclaim not only to each other, but to all of creation, Christ is risen. Christo ha resuscitado. Christos anesti.
Thanks for listening to Hill Country Homilies. For more information, visit Holy Annunciation Orthodox Church at www.annunciationtx.com. And please join us again next week.